right, guys, welcome back. Okay, so we're going to talk about CloudFormation now. If you don't know what CloudFormation is, it's a pretty spectacular service that allows you to take any kind of AWS infrastructure that you want and spin it up. And you can use this with a kind of a domain-specific language, but it's really just YAML or JSON if you're that kind of person. But Chuck Meyer, I think you're the main developer advocate for CloudFormation,
That's right.
right?
Yep, I'm a senior developer advocate for CloudFormation based out of New York. And I kind of had the idea for this live stream when I was walking around the New York Summit. I actually was thinking about, like, as people were setting up all the stages and setting up all of the sort of the spaces for the different sessions to take place, all the CloudFormation that was actually being deployed behind the scenes to set up that summit. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be neat to kind of get an inside perspective on that when reInvent came around? And so I put out a call to ask folks, are you using CloudFormation for your session? And I got an amazing response. I got a lot of folks that were sort of interested in sort of telling the story of the cool things they were doing with CloudFormation. And I had to narrow it down to 3. And so I've picked 3 folks that I thought maybe we could talk to right now and kind of find out what they're doing in their session and how they're using CloudFormation to deploy that stuff.
Sounds
so
good.
Cool. So first up, we've got Buzzy Busby here.
Today.
And Buzzy, I want you to tell us a little bit about your session, who you are, and what session you're giving at reInvent.
Yeah, sure. So my name is Richard Busby, or Buzzy as everyone calls me. We're doing a hands-on container services session at reInvent. We've got a fictional company called catsanddogs.lol, and the session is around taking an initial set of containers, deploying it into Amazon ECS, the Elastic Container Service, and then scaling it and doing a bunch of other things like continuous integration and deployment services to it, coping with scaling, coping with multiple regions, things like that,
awesome.
Throughout a 2.5-hour hands-on session.
Right on, cool. And so one of the things I thought was interesting about the way you're using CloudFormation is you had started out with this workshop or bootcamp?
Initially, it was a demo.
Demo, okay.
Yeah.
So as a demo, it was a giant sort of monolithic template. It sounded like you were having some challenges with management, and you were able to sort of break that up into smaller templates.
Yep.
Right? And we've actually got some visuals here. If you want to talk through it, we can maybe start bringing up a couple of graphics here.
So if we have a look on the slide here.
Is that coming up?
In a moment.
Maybe. Cool.
So this is how things were when we were doing a demo initially. We had a master stack, and you had to provide a whole load of parameters to that, which meant that you needed to know a whole load of information. And then the master stack would call some nested stacks. So there was a really tight integration between the master stack and the child stacks. We had to deploy them all at the same time.
And just what are the exact means of getting those inputs and outputs? Is it like function import? How does that work exactly?
So we were using a function import property of CloudFormation to pass the parameters that you put into the master stack into the VPC nested stack. We were then taking the outputs of that back into the master stack and handing some of those as parameters down into the ECS stack. Right?
Gotcha.
Now this mimics something that you might do in production, which is fantastic. But when we looked at converting this into something to do in a workshop, you've got a lot of parameters and you've got a lot of things that are all happening at the same time. Right. And what we needed to be able to do was break those apart and make them more loosely coupled and remove the amount of stuff that a workshop attendee needed to know ahead of time. And so we moved to this. So what we've got here is a system where we've got no parameters in the initial stack. We're creating a set of resources, and we're using this concept of stack exports. So if we have a look at the next slide, no, that's fine. We can just go and have a look at the code.
Is that all right?
What we're using is stack exports. So that's in the output section at the bottom of the stack here. Chuck's just going to expand that for us. And so we'll have a look at one of the public subnets, right? And so we export this out. It's exported out using my stack name and then the public subnet. And so what this means is that later on in the labs, the lab students can run other templates that reference that stack output. And all we need to know is the name of the stack that they created at the beginning of the lab in the morning. And if they can remember that, then they can deploy these later templates that pull those values out of the first stack. So this gives us a couple of things. It's more loosely coupled. We can do things over a period of time. And it's really reduced the amount of inputs, things like that the students have had to learn ahead of time.
Cool.
And it really does kind of mimic production in that way, because people are genuinely having these kind of centralized stacks, and then they build stuff as either it depends on or some sort of addendum to that central location of information.
Correct. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And one thing I really like about the use of exports like this is you can kind of give it your own sort of arbitrary name for that particular thing that you're referencing, right? So that you can make them sort of easy for consumers to be able to know how to find that resource.
Yeah, correct. So as you can see here, we're using a variable of the stack name because it can be unique, but then we're appending it with pub subnet 1. It's a public subnet, so something that's meaningful for a human to read as well, which is quite nice.
Well, thank you, Buzzy. That was really, really informative.
Good stuff. Thank you.
We're going to bring up our next person here. This is Jared Spiga. Hopefully I'm saying your name right, Jared?
Spiga,
Spiga?
yes.
Yeah, okay. And so, Jared, you are actually doing, well, why don't you tell us a little bit about the session that you're running?
Yes, certainly. I'm running a workshop session called Run Your CI/CD and Test Workloads for 90% less using Amazon EC2 Spot instances.
Whoa.
So, actually comes from some work I actually did with a customer, News Corp, where they were under some significant cost pressures, and they were tasked with slashing their IT budget significantly. So they've actually been successful in replacing around about a quarter of their production and dev and test instances with Spot instances using the methodologies that we'll cover in this workshop.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And so one of the things I thought was interesting in your CloudFormation, well, we can show quickly this architecture here. Why don't you talk us through some of the pieces here? But I like your use of Lambda and some of the ways that you're sort of using custom resources to sort of orchestrate some of these different pieces.
Yeah, certainly. You can probably see from the slide, it's a little bit busy. There's a lot of resources that are being provisioned by the CloudFormation template, but specifically, I wanted to focus, during the workshop, the audience and participants on actually concentrating on what elements that they would have to do in order to remain that's key on topic with the topic area being Spot instances and CI/CD pipelines. So basically, anything that is not related to those two topics, we've got CloudFormation spinning up. So specifically, one of the problems that we do face is that when deploying a test environment and deploying code to that test environment, we need to have a mechanism in place to actually spin up the Spot fleet and the resources that's required to actually run that test environment. And to handle that, I have built a Lambda function within the CloudFormation template. And that Lambda function actually takes all sorts of different values from within the template to actually pre-populate it, so I don't have participants having to edit the Lambda function and repopulate specific outputs from the CloudFormation template. It's all generated by CloudFormation and deployed as a Lambda function.
Cool. And so
search for AWS Lambda. AWS : Lambda.
I thought maybe it'd bring up some of the function code. I don't know if you want to talk through either of these. You've got two, and we should say that, so what you're actually deploying on Spotify is a Jenkins master and some Jenkins slaves that are going to be used to deploy code, right?
Correct, yeah. So the workshop begins with us just setting up a Jenkins instance on an on-demand instance, and we slowly build out and build more of our pipelines across onto Spot, and then later onto container instances that are running on top of Spot.
Cool.
So we start off with build slaves and build agents running on top of Spot, and then we build our pipelines to deploy our test environments onto those Spot instances, and then we start moving our Jenkins master instance from an on-demand instance, and we move its state onto an EFS volume, and then actually get Jenkins itself running on a Spot instance as well.
Very cool.
I remember there's this really cool feature, and I don't know if this is true in Node.js, but in Python, when you create a custom CloudFormation resource that's a Lambda function, you get the cfn notify.py library built into the Lambda function by default. So you can do like the signal. You can say, okay, signal done, or wait, or rollback. Like you can respond to all of those signals, and you don't have to import that library. It's just provided for you in the function. Is that true in Node as well?
It's certainly true in that I'm not really taking advantage of those features in particular. It's all fairly straightforward. Though if we were to deploy this in a production scenario where we do need to signal between different components, there are elements that you can actually take advantage of. My understanding is that the Node.js SDK also has those functionalities.
That's really cool. It's just like CFN notify. I remember, you used to, when you would spin up an EC2 instance, you would have that in the user data. It's like, okay, I tell the auto scaling group that it's really good and good to go now, and you can move on to the next part of your provisioning. That's really cool. We have a couple questions in chat that I want to run through really fast.
Sure thing.
So KFALCK asks, will available CloudFormation syntax ever be real-time synced to newly released services and features? And that's like a common thing that we get. And I'd say we're definitely getting better at that. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that we have an internal goals to try and improve that all the time. And we've got a couple of different models that we're using to sort of facilitate that. Some of the service teams are actually doing their own sort of integration into CloudFormation as they roll out new features, which is really helping to accelerate that process. So I think particularly for new services, you're going to see much faster acceleration of the CloudFormation. So.
Awesome. And then we've got a couple other questions. Fugue 2017 asks, does CF validate at design time? So there is a validate function in the CloudFormation API, and it does a lot of validation, but for some resources, some subcomponents of those resources, it won't validate. So sometimes you'll spin up a stack and you'll get an error, and then you have to investigate from that error. But typically, it can do, I would say, 95% of what you need to do at validation time.
Yeah, it really helps you out, particularly with making sure that your CloudFormation templates, whether you're using JSON or YAML, are syntactically correct, and kind of helps you get through some of those initial hurdles so that you can get to the real meat of troubleshooting the architecture that you're actually building.
And then we have one last question from Dret quadruple 7, which is are there security measures around deleting to the stacks? And I know for S3 buckets, there is a security measure where if the S3 bucket has objects in it, you are prompted and told like it won't be deleted until that bucket is empty. So that's another kind of component of CF and Notify. Like sometimes you can have a custom resource that goes and empties out the bucket, so it deletes cleanly if you really want that
also,
stuff.
when you're provisioning CloudFormation templates that have IAM resources, there's an additional checkbox that you've got to tick there before you can actually launch that stack.
And with the serverless transform as well, you have to say like.
And there's a really great blog post out there that one of my fellow developer advocates, Luis Colon, wrote on guardrails for CloudFormation that talks about things like termination protection and stack policies and some of the other things that you can do to really protect your resources within a stack.
Way cool.
So thank you, Jared. That was excellent.
All
right, thank you very much.
It. All right, so last but not least, we have David Faulkner coming up.
And I just want to encourage you guys, if you have any questions, please keep asking them in chat. You know, we're more than happy to answer your questions.
So hey, David.
Hey,
so,
how's it going?
It's going well. I think it's going well, hopefully. The reason that I selected you to come up, well, first of all, I want you to talk a little bit about yourself and your session.
Okay, sure. I'm a technical account manager based out of New Zealand. And for my workshop, I wanted to do something that wasn't an individual going through a guide. Instead, I wanted something a bit more dynamic. So the workshop I'm running on Wednesday at 12:15 is SID 312, DevSecOps, capture the flag. So the challenge that brought up is we obviously have people who have to be part of a team, and we need to have them register with us so that we can see how they're doing and so that we can send them templates, because the nature of the workshop is we're going to be sending them CloudFormation, interestingly enough, and they're going to be telling us whether those CloudFormations actually fit within our security policy or not, and that is the main challenge.
Cool.
So as someone who had limited time, I had to come up with a way that I could allow all of these individuals to register both as individuals, also as a team, and with my engine, so I knew who they were and that they existed in a way that was secure.
That's cool, and that was the piece that I thought was really intriguing, is that you're using some custom resources and some integrations, essentially that as each participant deploys their template, right, that template then registers itself into the engine. And I thought maybe you could talk us through a little bit of that. I know you've got a little bit of a diagram here that we can show up here.
Yeah, sure. So this describes how it works. So people participating in the workshop basically just need to run up a CloudFormation template. And the nice thing about this is otherwise I would have had to make some sort of UI for them to do this, some other way of them interacting with the system.
Right.
Here, they could just use parameters inside a template and run it. When they run it, what it's going to do is it's going to stand up a custom resource, which is a really powerful feature of CloudFormation that allows us to extend what it communicates with. And that custom resource is going to take those parameters and basically send those to my backend and say, hey, here's a new team who's available to participate, and here's the details of what they've built.
Very cool.
And that way I've avoided having to do some sort of cross-account communication or that complexity.
Love it, love it. And do you want to talk a little bit to the template itself? The one thing I think is cool is when you define your custom resource, you're actually using the naming convention that allows you to actually kind of define it with a string. Some folks, you might actually just do this as a CloudFormation custom resource. You can call it like that abstractly. But here you've given it sort of a specific name that you can reference, right?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, it's probably a matter of choice, but in my case, it makes it very clear what this thing is for and what it's doing. And if you look down the code, you can see very clearly what it does for me is that
Let's go over
custom resource. Yeah, okay, so looking at this is what I actually have in the back end.
And this is it.
This is it.
This
is
is
the
the
custom
code,
resource.
yeah.
So when they deploy this, the CloudFormation creates a custom resource object, and then on top of that, this custom resource is driven by a Lambda function. And this is the whole Lambda function. And what it's basically going to do is CloudFormation is going to send it the fact that the stack is going through a stage change, in this case usually a create, and it's going to grab those and basically just going to make a post call to my backend API, and now I know that that player and that team exists, and I can start to engage them as part of the workshop. And what's interesting about this is, although I've used it in the context of a workshop, it's actually a way that you could do all sorts of different kinds of cross-account communication where you don't want to have a direct linkage between the accounts. If you don't want to have network linkages or use cross-account stuff,
Right.
It's a way of doing an API handshake, if you will, between accounts and getting them to know about each other.
Very cool.
One of the cool things about Chalice is the ability, it'll look at what resources that you're using, and it'll build an IAM policy from what resources you're using. And that's one of the kind of advantages of using Chalice that I've seen. I don't know if you talked about that already, sorry.
No, I haven't, but Chalice was a really good tool. So for me, building these APIs that are all done in Chalice, it enabled me to define very succinctly what I wanted to happen, and it actually generated a lot of the CloudFormation for me. And at that point, after it gives you a lot generated, I could extend it in ways that I wanted to extend it. One of the interesting things that happened was my UI designer who was building my scoreboard, he came to me and said, well, actually to make this call, I need cores enabled. And so instead of having to go through line by line, in Chalice I just say cores on, and then regenerate the base CloudFormation, and then I'm done.
Very cool. Very cool.
So we have one question from the Twitch chat, and again, I'll encourage any of you guys, folks who are watching, please feel free to ask any questions you want. One of the questions is, what are some cool examples of custom CloudFormation resources that people have come up with? And I have a few off the top of my head, but have you guys seen any some like really, really cool custom CloudFormation?
I mean, a lot of the stuff that I've seen is typically about sort of going a layer deeper than the infrastructure and sort of populating data into things like databases or manipulating.
Bootstrapping, setting up
Bootstrapping.
schemas.
Yeah.
I've seen some really interesting things in the network layer around using custom resources to allow CloudFormation to provision hardware devices. Right?
And
things
even
like,
with IPv6, if you want to be able to provision that IPv6 stack, you can use a custom resource to get all the references and everything going.
Absolutely. So everything from extending CloudFormation to areas that it hasn't typically been, to injecting data. I'd love to start seeing more of these. Maybe that's something that we could start sort of pulling in from the community. As a developer advocate, I would love to start seeing what you all have been doing with custom resources, and maybe we can start showcasing
Hey,
some
maybe
of that.
that's not a bad idea. We can make a little repo, awesome custom CloudFormation resources.
I think that'd be great. So, yeah, I'm Chuck. I'm on Twitter. So if you want to hit me up there, we could definitely talk about that. So.
And then we have some other questions, but I think we're just about out of time, and I didn't mean to cut off your template. So I just want to kind of recap for a moment. We spin up reInvent with CloudFormation. It's not like this is a service that we make just for customers. We make this for ourselves too. I mean, this is how we operate a lot of the things that we deal with. Do you have any examples of not just sessions that are happening, but core infrastructure at reInvent that we're using CloudFormation for?
I mean, and as far as all of the pieces of, if you go in and walk into a boot camp, that's all being served up through CloudFormation. Any time that you're seeing sort of a complex set of resources or something that we need to do more than once, which to be honest, for things like summits and conferences, we always need, it's always in a template because it allows us to sort of iterate on it and improve it consistently, right, and add new features. So absolutely. I mean, there are over 2.4 million stacks being managed by CloudFormation right now. So there's a lot of stuff out there right now.
Wow. All right. Well, we're going to be right back, guys. We're going to take a quick break. And again, please stay tuned, everybody. Again, if anybody has any questions, you're more than welcome to answer them, and we'll be able to answer them on the Twitch chat. All right. Thanks.